June 2007, a Friday, the southwestern corner of Manitoba, Canada. The prairie stretches flat to the horizon, level as a tabletop, ruled into fields of canola and wheat. This is a country where the sky takes up 9/10 of everything the eye can see. The tiny village of Elie, population around 300, is living through an ordinary evening. People are coming home from work, someone is watering a lawn, someone is taking out the trash, children are riding bicycles along the gravel road. An ordinary Canadian Friday before the weekend. But if anyone had lifted their head at that moment and looked to the southwest, they would have seen something that had never been seen in these parts. The sky over there was not darkening, it was changing, taking on a color the locals had no name for. Something greenish, sickly, wrong. In 40 minutes, this village would cease to exist in the form it had held for nearly a century. And Canada, a country nobody had ever associated with monster tornadoes, would receive the only storm of the highest destructive category in its entire history. Subscribe to the channel if you want to know what actually happened during those 40 minutes. Because the official version did not appear right away. At first, nobody believed the numbers. To understand why what happened in Elie is considered an anomaly, you need to understand one thing about Canada. Tornadoes do occur here. Quite a lot of them, in fact, around 60 to 80 a year, and the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan and Alberta form what meteorologists sometimes call the northern extension of Tornado Alley. But Canadian tornadoes are almost always weak. They are born, they break a couple of barns, tear the roof off a shed, and dissolve. The reason is simple and comes down to geography. The warm, moist air rising up from the Gulf of Mexico has lost most of its energy by the time it reaches the Canadian prairies. It runs out of breath. It lacks the fuel to give birth to a genuine monster. In the entire documented history of the country, across decades of observation, not one Canadian tornado had ever been officially classified as Category 5 on the Fujita scale. The upper limit, the absolute ceiling of the Canadian atmosphere, was thought to be Category 4, and even that happened once in a generation. On June 22, 2007, the atmosphere over Manitoba decided to break its own rule. The morning of that day gave no warning. Forecasters noted instability, the possibility of thunderstorms, the standard summer picture. But by midday, the instruments began showing something that made the duty meteorologists at Environment Canada lean closer to their monitors. Over southern Manitoba, a combination of conditions was forming that the textbooks describe as theoretically possible, but practically rare to the point of vanishing. Below lay a layer of air superheated and saturated with moisture almost to its limit. Above it, a stream of cold, dry air was racing past at enormous speed. Between them, a rupture had formed, an atmospheric cliff, where the difference in temperature and wind speed created colossal instability. Meteorologists call this wind shear. When air at different altitudes moves at different speeds and in different directions, the entire mass of the atmosphere begins to rotate slowly and invisibly, like an unseen horizontal tube lying in the sky. Usually this leads nowhere. But if a powerful enough updraft arrives from below, it will seize that horizontal tube and stand it upright. And then what is born is called a mesocyclone. This is exactly what began to happen over Manitoba. Around 6 in the evening, radar registered the first supercell, not merely a thunderstorm. A supercell is a separate class of phenomenon, a rotating storm system that can exist for hours and can produce the most violent tornadoes on the planet. It was moving northeast, and it was growing. By 6:30, its top had punched through the tropopause, rising to the altitude where passenger aircraft fly, some 15 kilometers up. Inside it, hailstones had already reached the size of baseballs. A storm warning was issued. But here begins what would later become the subject of a long and painful reckoning. Elie, a village of 300 people, had no warning siren. There was no system that could howl across the rooftops and lift people out of their chairs. Information about the approaching danger spread by radio, by television, by phone calls from neighbor to neighbor. Some heard it. Some were down in the basement and heard nothing. Some were mowing the lawn and heard nothing but the engine. And at that very moment, 16 kilometers south of the village, the funnel had already touched the ground. At 18:45, local time, it descended onto a wheat field. And what happened next? fit no model at all. Normally, prairie tornadoes are thin, rope-like. They writhe and burn out fast. This one was different. It was wide, massive. Not a funnel, but a column, a wall of rotating air, and within the first few minutes it began to thicken, drawing in earth, dust, debris, turning from a grey cone into a black pillar. People out on the highway pulled over and filmed it. Those amateur recordings would later become key evidence. In them, you can see the tornado moving slowly, almost lazily, at about 40 kilometers an hour. The residents of Elie, in theory, had time. 20 minutes. 20 minutes to understand what was happening and get down into a basement. The problem was that many simply did not believe their own eyes. That does not happen in Manitoba. This is not our land. This is not our weather. And then the tornado did something nobody expected. It stopped. Not completely, but it slowed sharply, and at that moment, instead of beginning to dissipate, it began to gain strength. It is in such instance that what meteorologists call vortex stretching occurs. When a rotating mass of air narrows, its speed of rotation grows like an avalanche, on the same principle by which a figure skater pulls their arms in against their body and begins to spin faster. Inside that column above a field in Manitoba, wind speed passed 420 kilometers an hour. That is faster than a body falling freely through air. That is faster than a passenger jet at takeoff. At that speed, an ordinary plank becomes a projectile capable of punching through concrete. Gravel turns into buckshot. Air stops being air and becomes a solid body. And this pillar, already past every limit permitted to Canada, began to move again, straight toward Elie. What happened in the village between 1855 and 1905 lasted less than 10 minutes. The people who lived through it described the same sensation. First, the sound went away. Not silence exactly, but the familiar world of sound vanished, as though someone had packed the ears with cotton, leaving only a low roar that came not from outside but from inside the chest. Then the pressure fell. Doors began to be torn out of hands. Windows did not shatter, they were pushed outward. And then it arrived. The houses in Elie did not come apart gradually, they did not fold, they did not settle. They were lifted off their foundations whole and carried away, leaving bare concrete slabs, perfectly clean, as though the building had been neatly erased. Cars were lifted into the air and hurled hundreds of meters. One truck was later found driven into a tree several meters above the ground. In places, the asphalt was stripped from the road. Utility poles did not snap. They were pulled out of the earth along with their concrete bases. The electricity was gone instantly. Communications were gone. The village found itself inside total isolation, cut off from the world by a wall of rotating air. And here begins the thing that made the story of Elie known around the world. Roughly 1/5 of all the structures in the village were completely destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed, erased. The economic damage was estimated in the millions of dollars. The devastation was of a kind this province had never known in its history. And yet, listen carefully, and yet not a single person died. Not one. In a village struck by a tornado of the highest category, there was not one fatality. There are several reasons for this, and together they add up to an almost impossible coincidence. The 20 minutes of warning granted by the slow movement of the funnel, the tight layout of the village, where neighbors had time to warn neighbors. And above all, prairie houses in Canada are traditionally built with basements, because a deep foundation is necessary, given how the ground freezes in winter. That same harsh Canadian climate that makes life harder 12 months a year saved several hundred lives on that June evening. People sat underground listening as everything they had built disappeared above their heads. When it all fell quiet, the survivors climbed up and saw a place that was no longer their home. There were no streets, because no landmarks remained. There were no trees, only broken trunks, stripped not merely of leaves but of bark. The fields all around were covered in a layer of debris that stretched for tens of kilometers. Wreckage from Elie was later found many kilometers from the village. Meteorologists from Environment Canada arrived on site and began the work they had been doing for decades. They studied the character of the destruction because the intensity of a tornado is determined not by instruments inside the funnel, since no instrument can be placed there, but precisely by what is left behind. And what they saw made them doubt for a long time. That does not happen in Canada. That had never happened in Canada. The analysis took weeks. They examined foundations, the direction in which metal had bent, the character of damage to concrete, the amateur video recordings, the trajectories of debris. And in the end, a verdict was issued that entered history. Category 5, for the first time, and the only time. The Elie tornado remains the only officially confirmed storm of the highest category in Canadian history. It changed everything. In its wake, the country began revisiting building codes, warning systems, approaches to forecasting. It proved that the notion of safe geographic zones, of places where something cannot happen by definition, is an illusion we build out of statistics and habit. The atmosphere does not read our textbooks. It does not know where the border runs between countries or between categories. It simply brings together heat, moisture, and motion. And if one day those three things align in the right way above a flat field in Manitoba, above a cornfield in Oklahoma, or above any other place where people live, the result will be the same. The people of Elie rebuilt their village. They came back to the very same concrete slabs from which the wind had taken their homes. But every one of them now looks toward the southwestern horizon a little differently, because they are the only people in this country who know what the sky looks like when it decides to break its own rules.